Hello and welcome. Welcome. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Delighted to see you all here at the Warburg Institute in our auditorium for this evening's event. I'm John Tresh, Professor of History of Art, Science, and Folk Practice at the Warburg, and this talk really fulfills all three dimensions of my job title in a remarkable way. I'm very happy to be introducing tonight Jeremy Stolow, who is the author of Picturing Aura, a visual biography. And he's going to be talking with you and with a very distinguished group of interlocutors about what's in the work and what his thoughts were and the things that you can find in it. This entire evening will last about an hour and a half, 90 minutes, and the last half hour will be open conversation, so questions from the audience will be welcome. After that, just so you know where you are, there will be drinks reception outside in the teaching room, in the teaching suite, just past the lobby. Also a chance to buy books and have Jeremy sign books. So as I said, this is really an exciting event for me. Jeremy's work in the history of religion and the relationship between religion, technology, and media has been an object of fascination and real inspiration for me in my work over many years. He is professor of communication at Concordia College in Montreal, in Canada. So it's really a treat to have him here. He works on media history, material religion, visual culture, magic, religion, and the sciences. He's published many influential articles on those topics, as well as the book, Orthodox by Design, Judaism, Print Politics, and the Art Scroll Revolution. He's edited many books, which is evidence of his collaborative orientation. He's always putting together interesting new projects. Among his edited volumes are Deus in Machina, Religion, Technology, and the Things in Between, and Connect and Divide, the practice turn in media studies. So he's really connecting a lot of fields: anthropology, art history, religious studies, philosophy, and history. And it's really a pleasure to have him here today. He's going to start with a brief introduction to the book, some of its themes and some of its images. After he speaks, I will introduce our discussants one by one. But for now, join me in welcoming Jeremy Stolow.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you all for your time and your presence today. I really can't overstate how thrilled I am to be here, sharing a stage with what I feel is really a remarkable group of people whose thinking has in many ways shaped my own. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to learn something about this book that I have written and to try to address a range of topics here, which I'm still trying to think through myself. And it's especially for me a delight to be presenting this and sharing this work here at the Warburg Institute, since although I'm rather distant in terms of my discipline from art history, it so happens that at a key stage of my work on this project, when I was drowning, literally quite drowning, in a rather chaotic and ever-growing archive of images that I'd been collecting under the rubric that I called Pictures of Aura. I made a fortuitous discovery of Warburg's visual methods, and that helped me chart really an unanticipated line of inquiry. So it really is quite a delight to be here. And although I would hardly dare call this book Warburgian, I hope those of you who place yourselves in this tradition will recognize and find instructive my own attempts to define an object of study that reaches back into antiquity, but also proliferates in the present day, constituting a family of visual images and tropes that migrate from one cultural and geographic scene to the next, crossing and blurring the boundaries that we oftentimes use to divide science, religion, and art. So let me just offer a few words to get us started today about the focus, goals, and the narrative arc of this book, beginning with the title, which is meant to clarify that this is not a book about the activity of perceiving auras, although it was necessary for me to say something about those individuals who do claim to see such things. My mandate, rather, was more narrow. It was to reconstruct a roughly 150-year history of attempts to produce pictures of aura, in particular with the help of technical visual instruments, which were deemed capable of bringing to light normally invisible things. I focus on picturing in recognition of the peculiar nature of the aura as something which few of us can claim to have ever seen with our own eyes, and yet we all seem to know more or less what it is supposed to look like. Indeed, I'm willing to wager that everyone in this room is already quite familiar with auras, thanks to the countless pictures that you have encountered in your lives, whether in the form of faintly luminescent clouds, warmly colored hazes, rings of flames, solar disks, or crowns of lightning. These are some of the many ways artists, healers, clairvoyants, and occult seers at different times and places have chosen to depict the presence of some sort of energy or power that appears to cling to but also radiate beyond what we normally think of as our body's outer limit, the surface of our skin. A compelling and timeless esoteric vision for some, a clear instance of folk superstition or pseudoscientific nonsense for others. These pictures of radiant bodies are especially intriguing on account of their location in a boundary space that hovers between what we generally assume to be the very different activities of scientific knowledge gathering, spiritual contemplation, artistic expression, and popular amusement. My book tries to account for the ways that pictures of aura inhabit these diverse domains by tracing the distinct patterns of movement of pictures and picturing instruments across multiple routes and scenes of encounter and exchange. My ambition was to produce a provisional map of the widest possible range of techniques of seeing and sources of know-how that bring auras into being in and through pictures. This approach required a steadfast agnosticism with regard to the question of whether auras really exist or whether these are really real, at least according to the prevailing scientific consensus. Loosely inspired by the radical empiricist philosophy of William James, my questions were more pragmatic. Not to evaluate or to confirm the many denunciations of the aura or the idea of the human aura as some sort of pseudoscientific theory, and certainly not to speculate on the ideological or psychological function of a belief system dedicated to what many would insist is a non-existent fantasy object, but rather to ask what sorts of pictures are these and what sorts of work do they perform? Of course, I could not afford to ignore the many controversies surrounding an ontologically ambiguous object like the aura, but not at the expense of losing the principal focus of my study, the pictures and the picturing practices themselves, which are very much real and which can be examined as objects and practices that pass through the hands of different actors, with sometimes complementary and sometimes utterly opposed interests, assumptions, and goals. Although my practice was, for the most part, concerned with the modern business of picturing aura, it was necessary for me to have something to say about the embeddedness of the aura figure in a very long history of ideas and iconography, which we might begin with the etymology of the word itself, derived from the ancient Greek term for a gentle breeze, an aroma, a breath, or an emanation. According to Greek mythology, aura was a nymph, one of the daughters of Boreas, the god of the north wind. Analogizing her gentle breezy movements, the term aura was eventually applied to a range of subtle manifestations and rarefied dimensions of reality that defy the common sense divisions among spirit, body, mind, and environment. The protocols for visually depicting such a subtle presence have been elaborated through iconographic histories of devotional art, medical illustration, and cosmological diagrams that likewise can be traced back to antiquity, such as in the visual cultures endemic to the ancient Mediterranean, Persian, and South Asian worlds, where we find innumerable variations of figures of halos, aureoles, and related depictions of the power of solar light in the representation of gods and angels, saints and miracle workers, emperors and kings. These figures partake in a common trope of radiant extension and illumination, providing the visual grammar by which auras are rendered imaginable and recognizable in different times and places, not least in the present day, wherein we find in New Age popular culture collections of erratic images culled from diverse historical and cultural contexts and presented in tableaus, not unlike Warburg's own atlas, with the intent in these cases of invoking a timeless cosmic wisdom that it presumably unites all the world's ancient religious and intellectual traditions. Rooted especially in the Orientalist imagination of the theosophists and other occultist agents of the previous fin de siècle, these tableaux epitomize what I call the aura's image bank, a loose set of morphological and iconographic tropes that allow both makers and viewers to recognize the presence of an aura in and through its picture. But as I said, my book is above all concerned with the specifically modern history of aura visualization, which for the most part consists of a technical practice involving the use of devices that generate a range of images, static as well as moving images, diagrams, graphical representations, in situ optical enhancements, and projected lighting effects. Beginning with the uptake of photographic and electrographic equipment in the late 19th century, this turn to instruments for the visualization of the aura was predicated on the idea that such apparatus possesses powers of supersensory detection and registration, operating outside the bounds of so-called ordinary perception and depicting otherwise inaccessible states of being, functioning, in other words, as the technological corollary of a clairvoyant. Historians and archaeologists of visual media have done much to sharpen our understanding of the role of technical instruments as mediators of visual experience, singling out the previous fin de siècle as a period of dramatic technological change, closely tied to a reorganization of the foundations of knowledge, action, and experience that were registered in multiple domains. Epitomized by the startling discovery of the X-ray, the new media of the previous fin de siècle provided new opportunities, but also set new terms of exchange among professional scientists, occultist commentators, artists, entrepreneurs, and their various audiences, especially insofar as they were mutually concerned with the visualization of the invisible. Instrumentally mediated techniques of picturing aura thus added a radically new dimension to the practice that had hitherto been limited to the illustrator's hand. And the generation of these pictures enabled entirely new conjunctions of science, art, occultism, and popular engagement. So in my book, I attempt to map a roughly 150-year-long history of this modern enterprise of picturing aura. And this required me to operate at different registers and scales of analysis. At some points, I cleave quite closely to a single actor or technology, or even a single image, tracing its migration from its scenes of laboratory research to commercial application to art making, such as in the case, for example, of Kirlian photography, which tells a remarkable story how a once obscure instrument of Soviet parapsychological research ends up becoming a globally dispersed medium embraced by a whole range of cultural, countercultural artists, alternative healthcare professionals, entertainers, and sundry commercial agents. At other points, I expand my focus to examine more socially and geographically diffuse constituencies, including, for instance, the large number of amateur photographers and hobbyists who also populate the history of picturing aura. Indeed, the past century has witnessed a steady expansion of this vernacularization of the means and techniques of aura visualization, one apogee of which might be located in the latest wave of innovation in smartphone applications that have enabled an emerging genre that we might call the aura selfie, a combination of self-portraiture and self-monitoring that empowers individual users not simply to visualize their own auras, but to reproduce them in an endless, ongoing technologically mediated extension of their auratic selves. I wish I had time to say a lot more about these stories, and as well as all the stories that didn't make their way into my book. And indeed, by the time this book had gone into print, I was certain that I had only begun to scratch the surface of a vast world of activity that remains poorly documented and perhaps even more poorly understood. And so in recognition of the provisional state of my own attempt to account for this universe, I happily cede the floor to the others and eagerly look forward to learning your own thoughts about what you saw in the pages of the book that I wrote. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. And we're looking forward to hearing some of those stories of what entered the book and what didn't. Our first respondent or discussant is Professor Alison Wright of University College London, our neighbor just up the road. She's professor in Italian art. She's done really amazing and influential work on Florentine workshop practices. A book on workshop practices of the Pulai brothers, something like that. And most recently, work on the framework, a recent book on honor and ornament in Italian Renaissance art. And she's currently investigating gold and its material properties, as well as its symbolic and luminous properties. So it's really an honor and a treat to have her here to think about auras in the way that Jeremy has talked about them and the ways she thinks about them. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you so much, and it's been an incredible privilege to be able to enjoy reading this book. I'm afraid I can take no credit for anything in it because we were introduced by John. So I'm very grateful for him for reading some work I've done on Fra Angelico, which perhaps made him realize that I'm interested in halos and auras and radiant effects in optical technologies, of which I would include gold ground. So I should stay by this, shouldn't I? But yes, so recently I've been working on aspects of the reflective qualities of gold ground and how they can be made with inscription to produce ideas of about glory. Let's go forward actually and see. This is closest to what I've been writing about on the right-hand side. This is a kind of glory around Christ ascending into heaven in a triptych by Fra Angelico in the Corsini gallery. And it's remarkable for the way in which, with extreme care, the apparently radiating lines have been made to undulate so that you get a sense of a kind of throbbing power coming off the body. This is very unlike most halos and suggests a specific kind of engagement with a glory which suggests another time and another world. So obviously ascension into heaven, but it's twinned in the middle with Christ returning in a similarly somewhat violent glory of throbbing light at the Last Judgment. So the gold ground is what helps to show this relationship in eschatological time. So let's just go back to that initial comparison. With the example of radiant light in Fra Angelico's painting of the Paradiso, you have my interest was, how does this way of looking at light respond in some ways to poetic imaginings of paradise, for which, you know, Dante's Paradiso was an exceptionally important artistic attempt to talk about things that are invisible, with visible metaphors such as reflective mirrors and so on, and the idea of overwhelming light which blinds you and is not at all the benign force of light that we see in quite a lot of the images that we're looking at in Jeremy's book. And whole body radiance signifying in particular ways to repel people. You know, virgins who are in their cells can repel borders with brilliant lights around themselves. So and it's associated with the exterior of the cosmos and the empyrean and the encounter with God at the end of time. So there's a lot of ways in which something like the image on the right, which hasn't found its way into anything yet, and I was just, you will look at this and the juxtaposition with this fantastic Pyrrholian photogram of a hand, which is a very famous one, and think, well, this is just a nonsense morphological comparison. And of course, at some levels, that's absolutely right. But I want to draw from this comparison, which is, or juxtaposition rather, of it's another early 15th century painting in the 1420s, perhaps early 30s, by Giovanni di Paolo, so a Sienese painter who does all kinds of exciting things to make gold signify as light. And in this case, he's done something very unusual, which is this kind of scratchy aura just around the body into the gold ground, and setting a figure of Christ apart from the world that he's in, at the same time that he's looking very fleshy and covered with wounds. And there's a kind of interesting relationship between the wounds in the body as that which is near to human experience, and these scratches into the ground, which are intimating something ontologically apart and in a timeless place. So looking at these different kinds of mark making, And obviously there's this at some level claims to be a trace, and this is a form of representation. It did bring to mind to me this wonderful quote from Walter Benjamin that's included in Jeremy's book, where in a sort of side note to the Arcades project, he says, aura is the appearance of a distance, however close the thing that calls it forth. In the trace, we gain possession of the thing. In the aura, the thing takes possession of us. And that seemed to me to get straight to the point of certain kinds of represented radiances, that they come out and grab you rather literally. And the way in which Goldground operates is often separately from the representation, because it behaves in its own way in response to light. So I'm thinking about it as a kind of optical technology, one which can sort of shift from light to dark as well. This looks like a dark aura around Christ, but is meant, when it's clean, to be a bright aura around Christ, which can switch to darkness. And this positive negative arrangement is one which I find fascinating. And so the question, I guess, one question is the degree to which what we're looking at on the left-hand slide is a trace of an electrical effluvia from a hand, or whether it can become an aura because of how it's being looked at and represented, and perhaps entering into what I found very useful, Jeremy's idea of an image bank of aura. Certainly the one on the right does, I think. But my question that I hope I can articulate relatively straightforwardly, it's really a simple question, is having thought about grams and your physiograms and electrograms, some of them are very kind of light on dark images and registering rays on a plate. Some of them are completely psychedelic and very obsessed with spectral, sort of rainbow colors. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think about how the different kinds of colors that are being used in your image, in the images that you're studying, how much are they claiming to be about, the color spectrum of light, so kind of scientific, or where do they enter into the psychedelic or the having and sort of out of time colors? I was minded of the work of Hilma af Klint when I saw some of those pastel works by Charles Ledbetter. And Hilma af Klint was a Swedish painter, and she was looking at Rudolf Steiner's work and so on, and doesn't use black. And she's using a pastel color palette, which many of us will have seen at Tate Gallery in 2023, that looks out of its moment. It doesn't look at all like the color palette of its period, and that's another way in which it seems to perhaps communicate something about its cosmic origins, which is what her claim is. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to look at this work.
Yes.
Our next interlocutor is Richard Noakes, who is a distinguished historian of science and really the expert on the Society of Psychical Research. He teaches in the University of Exeter on the MA program in Magic and Occult Science, which is one of our great competitors in the MA field here at the Warburg. And he's written many interesting and important essays on the interactions between physics and the physical laboratory and psychic research around the turn of the 20th century, gathered most recently as Physics and Psychics, Occult and the Sciences in Modern Britain. So we're very happy to have Richard Noakes here with some comments.
So it's a great honor to be here today. I didn't actually meet Jeremy for the first time in person until today. It's been about 10 years since we first met online, and those of you that have read the acknowledgements of Jeremy's book might know that I was involved in reading early drafts, and it says a huge amount for Jeremy's integrity, intellectual steadfastness, that he moved from a state of despair about a book that I thought was tremendous and had to be published, to something that is an astonishing work of scholarship. One of the first things that struck me was how jealous I was that although our books have the same kind of cover, they both show a hand, I didn't manage to choose one that shares a cover with a pop album. Jeremy managed to get a George Harrison cover. I didn't. I mean, staying with the question of the publication, I think we should pause to think about who published this book, MIT Press. And for me, that's a dead impressive feat, because this is a book about a subject that's ostensibly pseudoscience, irrational, superstition, that's being published by a press that is renowned for publishing books on technology, on history of technology. So I think what Jeremy has accomplished is something that's extraordinary. And one of the ways that Jeremy has done this is to show the convergence of the practices that are involved in making the aura real, or as he calls it, to make itself imaged, and the practices that are involved in the so-called rational orthodox sciences. So one of the most impressive things is this is a material, practical history of the esoteric. So many books that are about Western esotericism are effectively histories of religious experiences or intellectual history. This is a book about practice. And I think that's an extraordinary feat. It's something I've been trying to push for 20 years, that actually the history of psychics is the history of practices as much as anything else. And it feels, I'm honored that Jeremy is alongside me in this long struggle to slightly shift the historiography of these phenomena as something that this is not just intellectual history. This is about the histories that scholars of science technology studies, history of science, history of technology have been doing for a long time. And what I think you and I do is has been trying to make the readerships of STS and history of technology more interested in the history of the esoteric. Interestingly, historians of esotericism haven't actually been interested in the aura, as far as I'm aware. There's a conspicuous lack of interest by those historians about water divining, radionics, radiesthesia, areas of the esoteric that touch on medical practice. And I think that's really interesting. Why is there this aversion? Okay, there's a lot on theosophy and on ritual magic, but interestingly, there are huge gaps in the Western esoteric tradition, history of occultism, history of esotericism, on the things that Jeremy's looked at. And I think what Jeremy's done is to try and remind us there's a whole constellation of other aspects of esotericism that are more practice-based. But we need to think more carefully about how we engage with them, because we cannot simply regard them as histories of ideas. They're also histories of practices. And we have to take seriously how these images are put together, what bits of kit are being used, how does that connect with so-called orthodox sciences. Another impressive feature of Jeremy's book is something that I've never been able to articulate as well as he did, and Jeremy mentioned it in his opening remarks, which is the Jamesian point about radical empiricism, which is to take seriously your actors' experiences without prejudging what you think they should have experienced, or prejudging their capacities to understand, interpret what they're doing. I never put it so eloquently as that I've never put it so eloquently as that in my book. But I think there's something very, very important about that positioning of the historian's voice about this material. And it's commendable that a book published by MIT Press has accepted that. I think it's really interesting that Jeremy's book finishes, there's an appendix where he has to kind of engage with the rational, skeptical, scientific critique. But I think it's wonderful that it's in an appendix. It's not there at the front, where he's saying, I don't believe this, or I'm only a historian, and so on. I think it's a structurally very clever thing to do, to shunt that question that I get asked all the time is, what do you really believe then? It's really clever. It's at the back, because actually that isn't an important question, right? The radical empiricist position doesn't want to do that. And I admire that really greatly in Jeremy's work. My question, if it is a question, is about the context. And maybe that's typical coming from a historian of science technology. Because when I see the front covers of Gernsback, pulp magazines, Science and Invention that Jeremy showed, I see a much bigger context of hobbyist science, of cheap electrical, optical kit being made available from the early 1900s onwards. And now we see that with that phone apps. I think there's a much longer, fuller story to be said about the democratization of this kind of stuff. It ties in with popular kit for ghost hunting that I'm working on, or attempts to build and patent Ouija boards and other spirit detection devices. So my question is, where we go next with fleshing out this bigger picture of citizen science that faces the paranormal, or it ties in with occulture, to use phrases that are very common in the history of esotericism, paranormality. Jeremy's work opens up the possibility of extending our understanding of popular science or science popularization to include these things. And sources like Gernsback are telling us this, right? They're inviting us to take seriously that this kit is available to do this stuff. These people have the leisure time to experiment in things that your professional scientists and doctors don't have time to, or don't want to, because of their professional identities. So that's my question. It's about sort of citizen science and democratization, popular science, and I'm sure we can come back to that. Thanks, John.
Excellent. So I hope you're taking notes, Jeremy. And our third speaker, I'm extremely happy to introduce, is Professor Chris Pinney of UCL. And his many accomplishments are known to many of you, but I've jotted a few down on a piece of paper, which I will track down in a second. I'm sure I could reconstruct them. He is a professor of anthropology and visual culture at UCL, who travels widely across the world, but across disciplines as well, dealing with photography in India, the rise of photography of India. One of his earlier books was Camera Indica, on the introduction of photography and portraiture in India. He has also written numerous books, numerous articles, organized many research projects, including one of interest to Alessandro Scaffi on images of hell in the subcontinent. He is well known as a historian, not only of culture and religion, but of the transformations in the technologies and the politics of visual cultures in India and worldwide. And it's really an honor and a treat to have him here to comment on Jeremy's book. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. John said we had 3 to 5 minutes each, so I'll try and keep it 5 minutes. Jeremy has written a wonderful book that constellates the supernormal in wider universes of the history of photography and the mechanics and semiotics of visualization, a history of Aura's global trading zone, which takes in India, Japan, Brazil, and the Soviet Union, as well as Europe and California, and delineates the image bank, what Stephen Greenblatt once called mimetic capital, that inflects Aura and ensures its longevity and suppleness. I have 2 short observations and 1 question. The book is as much about processes of picturing and visualization as it is about Aura, as Jeremy made clear in his opening comments. And at various points, I was put in mind of Bernadette Boucher's argument about the positivity of the visual. Jeremy discusses photographs that were designed to expose spirit photography as fraudulent. He reproduces Paul Nadar's, the son of the more famous Nadar, 1896 image captioned "Astral Body Obtained by Trickery," one of many photographs designed to expose such trickery. 60 pages later, Jeremy is noting that science and the supernormal have become interchangeable. Rontgens and Narkovits Yadko's, a Belarusian enthusiast for effluvia, that Rontgens and Narkovits Yadko's images were, quote, readily juxtaposed and even substituted for one another on the basis of their presumed shared powers of occult revelation. This speaks to the power of visualization. Bernadette Boucher, in a book called Icon and Conquest about Theodore de Bray's copperplate engravings of the Americas, drew a contrast between language's ability to negate. She refers to Montaigne saying, apropos of the Tupinamba, look, they have no breeches, i.e. they're naked, uncivilized. So she refers to the language's ability to negate and the visual's positivity. Tupinamba, Boucher argues, can only be visually depicted as sky-clad. They can't be shown as lacking clothes. She says in a rather resonant phrase that the visual is only capable of presenting positively in a certain form. Likewise, it is Nada's image that sticks in the mind, not the caption. I was familiar with similar images in Clement Cherew's The Perfect Medium, and I think I remember all the exposés as affirmations. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we discard the negation in the caption in favor of the positivity of the visual. And this fundamental feature of visualization, I think, erupts consistently throughout Jeremy's excellent book. My second observation concerns what I think of as the constellation of Emily Carr. We saw in Jeremy's introduction an image of the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, a figure staring at astral images in this elaborate architectural arrangement, which made me think of a very similar gallery of the forest artist Emily Carr's work in the Vancouver Museum of Art. She's famous for her paintings of redwood trees that ask you to have meetings with them, encounters with them, encounters with remarkable redwood trees. So I was struck by the absence of Karl Blossfeldt, who prefigures Walter Chappell, who does appear in the book. And I wonder whether via Benjamin, this could make for an alternative ecological lineage. I kept expecting the Curlian effect to turn into the Gaia effect. This is hinted at where Curlian photography is described as feeding, quote, a much broader fascination with the visualization of a non-mechanistic cosmos. And then in direct echoes of Benjamin on Blossfeldt, quote, a universe saturated with secret radiances, hidden dimensions, subtler architectures. That makes me think of Benjamin's phrase that Blossfeldt shows us what is hidden in waking dreams through his botanical photography. But it's striking that the humans configured by aura photographers seem resolutely neoliberal. It's as if supernormal photography had the opposite effect to the fabled Earthrise image of the Earth seen from space, an image credited with kickstarting ecological consciousness. So my concluding question for Jeremy concerns the topic he raises in his epilogue about the historical juncture in which we position the knowledge that his book generates. I kept thinking about the anthropologist Evans Pritchard's famous claim in Witchcraft, Oracles and Magic Among the Azandi, 1937, that, quote, witches as the Azandi conceive them cannot exist. This is his declaration of a scientific anthropology's disinclination to be contaminated by faulty beliefs. And famously, Eduardo Viveros de Castro uses this to build up a discussion about what he calls the epistemicide of colonial anthropology. Jeremy clearly wants to avoid epistemicide of aura photography and succeeds in the tricky balancing act of addressing both believers and skeptics. He says in the epilogue that skepticism is not a useful starting point for engaging his topic. But as we transition from an age of imperfect but strived for critical rationality to narrow-streamed alternative facts, does this change the maths of the balancing act? My thinking here and my engagement with Jeremy's book on this point is informed by my experience in the last few years of the reception of a book I wrote, published in 2018, on mirages, which was written at the end of what I think of as the end of the age of critical rationality, when it still seemed interesting and worthwhile to probe the evanescent and mysterious in the spirit of second wave theosophy, about which Jeremy has many interesting observations. But this work on mirages got picked up by Californian radio stations with names like Midnight at the Oasis and New Age magazines who wanted to enroll it in their new universe of alternative facts. And that emergent world of alternative facts changed my enthusiasm for eulogizing the evanescent. The book was really an investigation of the global political history of mirage epidemiology. Why were they associated with West Asia and Islam rather than Japan, where they are as frequently reported? Answer: Japan had spectatorial democracy, at least in the late 19th century, where things could be seen clearly, whereas Islam was about Oriental despotism and opacity. But very few people wanted to hear this. They wanted to be seduced by a general ineffability. So my question to Jeremy, and it's really a request for him to pick up on and elaborate his discussion of this that appears in his epilogue, concerns how he situates his book in the current political landscape, in which formerly subjugated knowledges have become dominant. Who does he imagine his readers to be, and what conclusions does he hope they will reach? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks to all three of you. If I can ask everyone to come up and take a seat here at the round table. We're going to all be gazing attentively at you, Jeremy, as you try to respond to the provocations and questions of the other interlocutors. So, Jeremy, basically, the floor is yours to answer as and how and which questions you might like.
Wow, this is tremendously humbling. There's so much here. And thank you to all of you for first having spent time reading whoever reads long books now in this era. And this is the first time I've encountered readers. So this is really very exciting for me. I think maybe sort of one thing that I notice is a thread that ties a number of the questions together here is this moment that we find ourselves in where how do we even begin to think about writing about an object like this, where all of the, I think the critical tools that are most readily available to us are the ones that suggest that we know that there are no such things as these kind of magical, fantastical objects, and that what's really interesting is to produce some kind of a sociological analysis of why people might believe in such things, or what power such images have ideologically or aesthetically or effectively. I think those kind of analytical tools are so readily available. And these were the things I think that I began myself with in this project. I was kind of interested in New Age culture, and I was interested in early 20th century theosophy and some of the relationships around some of these questions. But one of the things I think that pushed me to try to reimagine this project was that every time I talked about it, people wanted to know if I thought auras were real. And I always found the question very uncomfortable. And it's like, well, I'm going to be clever and say, I don't need to answer this question. And as Richard points out, I did end up producing an appendix where I tried to go through all the scientific literature about that tries to evaluate whether auras are a scientifically credible theory or not. And I think that one of the things that that work increasingly pushed me to do was to recognize that that we do need to think about another kind of an analytical approach for these sorts of phenomena, because otherwise we're left with this sort of imperious assumption that we know better than the actors that are involved in these activities. And that our goal as analysts is to explain how and why people might believe in these foolish sorts of things, or what purpose and what purchase they might have in some kind of sociological context. And so I tried to do something very intentionally naive, which was to say, well, auras are real insofar as these pictures produce these images. There is something that is being brought forth, as I think you put it so beautifully, Chris, that, you know, the power of the positivity of the image is something that we cannot deny. Pictures can't not show us something. And the question of what these pictures do is an open-ended one. And I think this is where, you know, we have opportunities to make these kind of historical comparisons as well. And I'm thinking about the kinds of questions you raise, Alison, about the ways in which undulating lines and engraved gold and questions about sort of different means of producing a representation of light in these different material forms creates a sort of, there's an opportunity for us to think about the continuities or the conceptual overlaps between what different forms of devotional art have been producing for many centuries in many different places, and these kind of more popular conceptions of what aura photography might be doing in the 20th and 21st century. However naive the kind of Orientalist imagination of sort of trying to create this universal wisdom, there's something in the actual practice there that I think needs to be addressed somehow. Richard invites us to think about this as a kind of citizen science or a hobbyist science, which is not so far removed from the ways in which sort of ordinary consumers engage with these phenomena, the way in which a whole range of actors are involved in the business of making these visuals come to life and putting them to work in very different contexts. And I think that it's so much more productive to sort of just naively explore the way this world is emerging and what's going on than it is to sort of have to begin and have to be called upon to first decide what is credible and not credible, what is real and not real, and just to sort of see where it goes. But this raises other problems. And I think, Chris, your description of this uncomfortable experience you had of what happens to your book on mirages, I think is really telling of the moment we live in, where, you know, we might, for all kinds of good methodological and philosophical reasons, be very skeptical of a certain kind of faith in a scientific critique that begins by assuming we can adjudicate the world according to a certain kind of scientific account. And then our task is to sort of explore the ways that these things might be imagined differently. How do we square this with this moment we live in today, where there is this proliferation of self-defined sciences and people producing their own, doing their own research, and ebbing away, chipping away at the authority of scientific institutions to do the hard work of adjudicating what, what can be responsibly said about the body, about the world within certain scientific frameworks. So I'm left with a eerie, an uncomfortable relationship with those that who sometimes catch me at the end of my talks and want to collaborate on some aura project or some other, some of the ways in which I gained permission for the reproduction of some of the images involved long conversations with different folk about what was the purpose and goal of my book and what are the images for and what are they supposed to be doing? What are they supposed to tell us? I still feel that there's an important room to be made for this kind of intentionally agnostic, naive approach to what aura's images do, because I think that it creates new ways of trying to think beyond the polemical divides between science and non-science, or between serious research and fanciful popular construction, and that the stakes of not doing that are perhaps even harder. But I recognize that this is something that it's balancing oneself on a razor blade that's very hard, and I'm really I'm still struggling for a language to think both critically and intentionally naively about these kinds of objects. So thank you for the provocations and to show that this really is something that doesn't have an easy answer. And I think my attempts at the end, and it's sort of a series of endings. There's an epilogue where I deal with one version of it, and then, as Richard said, there's an appendix where sort of the science comes back again. I think that shows the sort of discomfort that I think anybody addressing this kind of a topic necessarily faces, which is that we must somehow address this question of what we know. I don't think that it's a fully resolvable question. So hopefully I've raised some ways of thinking about this and new opportunities to pursue it further, but I don't think I can solve this myself. So I'm grateful for your own interventions to help me think about it.
Well, I think that question of whether there can be a single answer about what these images are images of, or whether the thing that's said to be in them really exists, your both naive and critical approach is manifest in the fact that you're looking at them across multiple epistemic communities. They're used by different people in different ways, and the historical dips that you make into earlier instances highlight that. They mean different things for different peoples. I think that's part of the question that's raised about the politics of aura. For which group? For who? When? What does it mean to have an aura in an era that is majority secular, majority post-Protestant, versus having aura in a majority Catholic environment, for example? And your point, Richard, about the democratization of these practices, I think, is in nice tension with Chris's point about the conspirituality reuse of some of these kinds of technologies and theories, where the conspiracy theorists who think that the dominant powers are against us, we have to do our own research and find these hidden forces, are now in power. And what do we do with that political situation?
But wouldn't the other aspect of that be that it's a perennial dilemma, but it's a dilemma with a history, and that history is significantly suddenly changed. And so these formerly subjugated knowledges, which I think as as academics of a certain kind, we want to embrace, our natural tendency is to try and articulate their voice. And I think, second wave theosophy, was a subjugated knowledge with a political agenda that in many ways was extremely admirable. And it's very easy to stand very close to that project. But recently that subjugation has been transformed into near dominance.
I'm just thinking of Robert Kennedy Jr. At the head of Health and Human Services at the US, who is powered by and supported by a number of New Age thinkers and New Age supporters who are interested in aura science, often among other modes of knowledge, as part of an anti-vaccine, anti-traditional science, anti-establishment movement, just to put a name on some of what you're talking about. And that vies with the kind of oh, great, it's citizen science. Everyone's participating and finding things out for themselves. So it's so interesting to see this play out on a fringe science rather than, say, weather science or mainstream medicine.
Yeah.
And I mean, the point that you make in your book about in the historical moment, it's absolutely unclear what will prove itself to be the scientifically credible, authoritative tool or method, X-ray, as opposed to all the other forms of ray that were out there and being theorized at that moment and what they might be. X-ray nobody would doubt, and obviously it has this image afterlife that you show in really interesting kind of products, and I find that really interesting as well, both the citizen science and the kind of the money making that goes on around these kinds of products, that you can all buy one and have one at home. People are making a lot of money as well as putting a lot of faith in those, that you have a culture which is allowing for that kind of, cheap availability of do it yourself at home. And, I suppose one of the things this is to lower the tone a little bit, but, one of the things I thought about was, how incredibly collectible a lot of those objects are that you were showing, the goggles and the aura goggles and the kinds of things which we could put in our collection of obsolete technologies in our department, and people would want to work on them. So I'm wondering also whether, one question to you would be, is there an exhibition in your book? I suspect there is.
I think in many ways, the linearity of the text was the hardest thing about trying to collect, because I really saw myself as trying to produce a map or a collection of things. And it was, and in many ways, it would probably be more amenable to a kind of a digital humanities sort of project where you could hyperlink and connect all these different objects and pursue because it was so many different layers of histories of people who connected to each other and different objects that really, I think, spoke to multiple layers of these histories, whether they be about popular entertainment or about different medical practices or about parapsychological laboratory research or philosophical ideas about the cosmos. So there was, it was very hard to think about a sort of a series of lines that would narrate a particular story, because I don't think there is a single history here. And that's what was part of the challenge of trying to write about this, like something as general. And in many ways, it's kind of insane to try to write a book about something so general called the aura. And to say that, I'm going to pay little attention to geographic context because and my strategy methodologically was follow the instruments, follow the actual images. Where do they go? And I found myself in an increasingly global circulation of, apparatus and instrument schematics and images that were being reproduced all around the world. So there was this kind of incredible circulation and things that were reproducing themselves in all these different contexts. So there is a kind of way in which I think the sort of narrative of a linear piece of writing makes that harder, because it invites a sort of an argument and a conclusion, which I don't think I have. But I think, sort of, I end the book with this story about, of all things, phantom limb pain, which I learned about and found quite a fascinating topic. And one of the things that I found quite incredible in some of the strategies for addressing phantom limb pain. You have to read the chapter to find out why I ended up on phantom limb pain. But one of the things that I found so incredible that I learned, which is more or less accepted now among neurologists who study and who deal with treatment of phantom limb pain, is that there are all kinds of illusions that can be created where people through mirrors and now in virtual reality goggles and things can create images of their missing limbs And even although they're deeply skeptical, you know this is a trick, you know that this is an illusion, they actually produce incredible effects of reducing pain. And so there's something, I think, in that story that I found so powerful and persuasive as a way of sort of thinking about the role and the relationship between the imagined and the real, the role of the image, the sort of the positivity of the image, as Chris describes it, that I think addresses some of these questions about how this relationship between the visual and the effects of the visual, which I think can't simply be accounted for through a sort of a skeptical critique. And I think that's something that maybe is a helpful instruction for a lot of criticism in historical and human sciences around the ways in which we assume our own objects of study must be accounted for in some way. So how do you deal with this question of the sort of the positive, as Chris put it in referring to Bernadette Boucher's work, the positivity of the image? And I think this is something that I know this is a big theme in this institute, thinking about the positivity of the image through its long histories and chains of migrations. And, you know, sort of one possible route to that is to say that images have these archaic pathological functions to produce different emotional states. That's one way I think we can think about it, but I think there's a whole range of opportunities, and certainly interfacing the way in which art historians and historians of science and historians of photography and other media share overlapping but not quite the same vocabularies and the same ways of trying to parse through what is the power of an image.
I have a disciplinary question along those lines.
Okay.
Just that, Richard, you pointed out as an historian of science that you wish that historians of esotericism would take on board some of the more pragmatic and open-ended approaches to history of science and its objects that have developed in that field.
Yeah.
You wish esotericism would read history of science. Can you imagine what historians of science taking on board Jeremy's methodology or his choice of objects might do? Should they be reading? Should historians of science be reading the history of the occult and of esotericism, and what might be the effect?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, you know, there are plenty of historians of science and technology who ought to be very interested in Jeremy's work. If I just take David Edgerton, famously argues for a history of technology and use, rather than histories of technology that focus on novelty and innovation. Well, a historian, his history of technologies and use would have to embrace histories of the technologies that Jeremy's talking about. Yeah. Would have to embrace this wonderful fuzzy area between toys and entertainment. You know, at what point is a toy no longer a toy, or goggles and the kind of things you mentioned? At what point are they kind of not valid in histories of technology? Yeah. So I think the door's already open, even in areas like history of technology, to embrace history of the kind of histories of esotericism that Jeremy's writing, that histories of use, they're using all this stuff, they're using kit in different ways. So, but again, historians of technology are still a bit coy.
They want to talk about trains.
It looks too much like toys and entertainment, but it's there.
Yeah. Could I come back to the phantom limb? Yeah. That discussion comes after a discussion of the phantom leaf.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the thought that the limb triumphed over the leaf. And I wonder whether you could say something about the thought that, although your kind of concluding thought is that we should settle aura in the kind of paradoxical space of Latour and Haraway's Nature's Cultures, actually it seems to be about the body of the subject. And not about ecology. I mean, so what's your understanding of why that has? I mean, it seemed like such a candidate method for expanding consciousness into Gaia,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem to happen. That seems extraordinary in many ways.
You've touched on something that's really, I think, at the very heart of a lot of New Age culture, which is this kind of conservatism really around sort of, this constantly returning back to the body, the human body, as the sort of focal point. And, sort of, although there are all of these attempts in aura photography and aura representation to sort of compare humans with botanical specimens and with plant life of various kinds, or other attempts to sort of show that, the kind of radiant world that we can capture in a painting, in devotional art, from the Renaissance or from previous times, or from antiquity, to these different photographic apparatus in the 19th and 20th century, to these sort of tell us about a radiant universe where all things are flowing. Somehow it always returns to this very motivated version of it that has to do with the human body. And that maybe says something about sort of the close alliance of New Age culture and alternative medicine, that there's a strong interest in wellness and healing. And so there's a strong motivation that it's the bodies that matter. It's my body that needs to be healed. So that's where the great interest, I think, for a lot of the kind of popular culture around auras lies. And there's much less around sort of, the radiant experience of nature per se. But it's always sort of, one seems to always bleed into the other in ways, sometimes very surprising ways. So the way human bodies become plant-like in a lot of these visual exercises. Maybe it's the visual work that undoes some of the narrative around this focus on the human body itself. I don't know, but it's really interesting to think about why there is this constant conservatism around, because, auras really cling to human bodies, and only so far. These radiant structures only go a little bit out. They're not endless. We cling to human bodies. They go a few inches, a few feet, and that's it. There isn't a whole universe that gets connected up to this, although there's always invoked, theoretically, visually, there's this structure that limits it, in the same way as much of the devotional art. It's always, Christ's energies, they stop at a certain point. There's a visual limit. And it marks Christ's body out from the rest of the world somehow. So there's something about this that I think, and sometimes it's done with color. As you pointed out, color is such a huge theme here.
But in the 21st century, it's also hyper individualized.
Yeah.
You have your aura, just like you have your ID card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's increasingly, these opportunities are like, you have your aura, you can monitor it daily, hourly even. So.
And so
could I just quickly say that in respect to the positivity of the image, of course, this is something that your book shows in all, extremely well, but it also talks about where the image fails the experience quite a lot. And I mean, that was one of the things I was interested in when I was thinking about, how did people think about paradise when they'd read Dante? And how does a painter even begin to get at something as incredibly complex and sophisticated and spatial and full of, analogies and so on. So it was interesting me to, hear how somebody like Ledbetter talks about the complete inadequacy of the watercolor he does to the experience of being surrounded or seeing pulsating light that keeps changing color, and all those ways in which the technology of his moment couldn't possibly image that. So I think it again depends who's doing the looking, rather, doesn't it?